Hey everyone, so I am Jesse Marks, Associate Editor here at the Voice of San Diego, and I'm taking over for Scott Lewis, who is our Executive Editor and our CEO today for today's episode of VOSD at Home. And I'm pleased to do that, and I'm really happy to talk about a topic that is not just important to me, but also important to VOSD and the work that we do here every single day. Late last week on Friday, we filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against a pair of federal agencies. And today I'm going to dig into a little bit about why those types of lawsuits are becoming increasingly common ways for journalists to get information, to get access to information, and it's necessary in order to enforce federal public records laws. So if you're a regular follower of ours, you've no doubt heard us or seen us written quite a bit about the California Public Records Act. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is the federal version of that. It's the National Open Records Act, which was intended about 50 years ago to provide some transparency on how government was working and what it was doing. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of context about the issue that we're going to talk about today. I should note up front as well that we're going to take questions from viewers towards the end of it. So first I'm going to talk to our guest. And so initially some of the context behind what we're going to talk about today, which is at the center of the lawsuit that we filed, has to do with unmanned aerial aircraft systems or vehicles, otherwise known as drones. You'll hear a lot of jargon when people talk about this topic, but I think we're just going to keep it to drones generally. But a little bit of history first. In 2018, the city of San Diego was chosen by the Federal Aviation Administration as a testing ground for the integration of drones into society. Various public interests and private interests are now getting together. And what they're doing is they're testing and experimenting with drones in order to see how that they could make deliveries, how they could also be used for law enforcement purposes. But when we talk about that drone program, what we're talking about are drones that are 55 pounds or under. So we have a photograph we wanted to show everybody. The program here regionally is known as the Integration Pilot Program. So if you hear us use the acronym IPP, that's referring to these types of drones. Like I said, these are in commercial use, they're smaller. And then let's compare that to another drone. So this would be a military grade drone. And these are what, this is what's at the center of our lawsuit, and it's also at the center of some of the coverage that our guest has done. These are anywhere up to 80 feet of worth of wingspan. They also weigh up to about 12,000 pounds. So these are a totally different type of animal. And what we're going to talk about today are these military-grade drone projects, in particular, one in San Diego that's unprecedented. And so here's a story that I wrote earlier in the week about a little bit about the project itself, as well as an explanation behind why we've decided to sue a pair of federal agencies to try to get more information about this project. But first, I'd like to bring up our guest, the amazing Katy Stegall, who was a former intern of ours at Voice of San Diego last summer. Katy and I worked on a number of projects, including one that had to do with police officers who were convicted of criminal offenses, which seems relevant now, but it's a whole other issue for another day. In the meantime, what Katy and I are going to talk about is this particular drone project in San Diego. When she was interning at the Union Tribune in the fall, Katy wrote about it, and so she's here to give us her thoughts and explain to us the situation. So thank you, Katy, for being here. You're awesome and welcome.
Thank you.
So why don't you walk us through, for starters, what you found? There was a local defense contractor named General Atomics, and they were interested in doing what exactly in San Diego? And so how did you get on this story, and why did it capture your interest and your attention?
Yeah, so I got a tip from a good source of mine, and he sent me a link, didn't give much context, and it was the press release talking about how this drone was going to be flying over San Diego, and they had the city support. And I didn't understand fully what was going on in the press release at the time, because it was filled with jargon. It was super complicated, wordy. They had a bunch of $3 words that no one could understand, and it kind of flew over my head. Ignore the pun there. um, and so I started looking into it and Googling a bunch of words, and I started realizing that this drone that they were talking about was not just these little tiny drones that we showed earlier. It was a fairly large drone, as we said earlier, with like a 79-foot wingspan. And I started kind of looking in more to it and looking into the company. And my biggest question was, well, when did San Diego support this? Who supported this? Why does this press release from General Atomics say that the city of San Diego supported it? And I started asking around. I was trying to get any city official to comment on this. I sent over 30 emails, probably not to the appropriate people at first. And I was just trying to get anyone to comment on who approved this and what this project was about and what was happening. And no one could actually give me answers. And finally, after going through a few different channels of communication, the city's PIO finally told me to contact IPP. And I was talking to them, and they also didn't really have ownership over it. And they said that they were just taking, they were kind of connecting people and being the middleman for connecting General Atomics to people who would, like, companies who would generally be interested in what they were offering. But the weird part of it at the beginning was the fact that no one in the city was really willing to take ownership or talk about this or really knew what was going on. And I was like, this drone has insane capabilities. It's like the model that it was built after is the Predator drone, which I don't know if you're familiar. Like, yeah, of course you're familiar now.
But explain it for people.
Yeah. So the Predator drone, it is one of the I'm going to say most lethal drones in the world. That seems like an accurate thing to say. It can see through walls. It was used overseas to kill people. It's one of the deadliest drones that we've ever made in the world. And this drone, called the Sky Guardian, was the new and improved version of the original Predator drone. And the only difference was that it wasn't armed with stuff that could kill people. And so the surveillance capabilities of this drone had me really concerned. And the fact that it did have such insane capabilities, and there was no one to really take ownership for that, was really worrisome to me.
So the company basically said, look, we have a weaponized drone. We're going to repurpose it for civilian reasons in the United States. We would like it eventually to do XYZ, but first we need to test it to prove to everybody that it can fly above a dense metro area. They chose San Diego as the test site in order to do that, in order to take this technology that had been developed overseas in war to bring it back home for commercial purposes. What do we know about the potential uses of that drone? What does General Atomics say they want to use this drone for down the road?
Well, so I feel like something we should point out is I won't go obviously into the whole history of it, but San Diego, why San Diego's chosen kind of as a prime location for surveillance when we're wanting to test new surveillance technology. It's like this weird perfect trifecta of military, urban area, border region. These things come together to make San Diego one of the best places to test surveillance technology, right? So it being done in San Diego makes sense to me on that front, why it would be chosen. But the fact that there was an article where they had the CEO of General Atomics saying that he wanted to get this drone into the hands of local law enforcement and for it to be in civilian airspace, and that was about it. There was no real like why they were wanting to get it into, you know, like commercial, why they were wanting to like get it into a commercialized area and things like that.
So some of these drones are already in use, right? Like there are certain agencies which use the drone to patrol the border, similar drones to patrol the border. So the company says, hey, we would like to use this for surveillance purposes. They've been pretty clear about that, right? But they've always framed it around, we would like to surveil infrastructure.
Yes.
Right. And so, but what you noticed was that the CEO of the company elsewhere, at least in relatively recent history, had been quoted in an industry, in a defense industry article as basically saying, I'd like to get these in the hands of law enforcement. But when you ask the company about it, and when you ask officials about it here, they said that that wasn't actually a use of the technology, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So they were saying that they wanted to use it for infrastructure purposes. And an example that they that I was repeatedly given was, for example, like the Tijuana River sewage problem that we have here. They wanted to be able to look that over, and they gave a couple of other examples, but I feel like the TJ River was the best one. But they kept the people from IPP kept saying this was not going to be used for surveillance purposes. That I was being kind of, you know, dramatic about it. And that the concerns I had were completely unwarranted because they would never use technology like this for an evil purpose, basically, or surveillance purposes.
And so who is overseeing this project? So you went to the city of San Diego, and the city of San Diego basically said, no, we're not officially a part of this. Then you went to the Economic Development Corporation, which is a sort of public-private kind of partnership place. And they also said, well, we don't officially, we're not officially a part of this project. So it seems like all of the roads kept leading back to General Atomics. Who actually is overseeing this project, and where are we getting information from?
Well, so that's the problem, right? There's no information on this. Every single avenue that you would turn to, nobody has answers. It keeps getting passed off in different directions. It's like this, you know, hot potato that everyone's throwing around and no one really knows what to do with it. And it just keeps getting passed around frequently. Like the city said that they had nothing to do with it, and then IPP and the EDC said they had nothing to do with it. And once I started talking to, I was trying to talk to General Atomics reps, and they still wouldn't give me much information on it. They would just send me press releases. And I was asking very pointed and specific questions, and they would just send me press releases. And I was repeatedly asking the same questions, was not getting answers from them. And I think that's the worrisome part, is when I left, where I left my story off back in November or December, I believe it was December, is that no one really knows anything about this project. And the people that do know about this project aren't willing to share information, which is really concerning.
So the technology on board the drone was fairly sophisticated. I think you reported that even from 2,000 feet up, it was potentially capable of recognizing faces, right? So what were the concerns, given the technological capabilities of this drone, what were the concerns of privacy experts that you talked to?
I mean, human, like, you know, civil liberties violations from the get-go. Facial recognition technology can be so bad for a country or just in general, because it's not only is it mishandled and misused, it's a technology that people still don't fully understand, and it can, you know, the way that it works. So one, it's completely discriminatory against people of color. It's less accurate with people of color and with women versus, say, like a white man like yourself. It's ineffective. It's dangerous. It's facial recognition technology is being used in other countries in very harmful ways. But they were concerned about, you know, there was privacy concerns all across the board.
And one of the things I remember from your story was specifically the idea that maybe there's no intention of selling these devices to law enforcement at the moment, or that's what officials are saying, and that's what the company is saying now. But it doesn't mean down the road that they won't be sold to law enforcement agencies. And that struck me as a very important point in your story, which is, you know, at the moment, these devices might be used to analyze, say, infrastructure after a flood, which sounds like a completely reasonable use. But what's to stop anybody from 5 years from now selling these to SDPD? But I remember SDPD had a really interesting response in your. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I talked to a couple different police departments, but one comment that specifically stood out to me, so I had to quote it, was that so San Diego is already having some problems with the smart streetlights, and there is a lot of privacy concerns over the smart streetlights, how they're being used, the public being kept in the dark about it. And one of the captains at SCPD, when I talked to him about it, he basically said, people are already really concerned about the smart streetlights. If, what if we added this, it's going to make people are going to freak out about this. If they're already freaking out about the smart streetlights so much, they're going to lose their minds over this, essentially.
Yeah, essentially, like, too much on my plate already. I can't deal with that.
But yeah, I had other law enforcement agencies to talk about how they just their departments weren't equipped to have a drone this big. And they made it sound like it being in the hands of local law enforcement was unrealistic, but at the same time, we can look at, say, ALPRs, like automated license plate readers, and how they were used at first. That was a technology that was originally used by the military and by Border Patrol, and it didn't have any intention to be in civilian, in domestic areas. But now ALPRs are a regular part of our society, and they're used all the time. So there's a repeated history with numerous technologies showing that that it's not entirely unrealistic for it to go from military grade stuff and then be integrated into civilian society.
So the other thing that caught my attention, and the reason why I wanted to dig into this a little bit further myself, is because the FAA, which is the nation's aviation regulators, essentially, were the lead regulatory agency on this, and they were missing from your piece. And I reached out to them, and it was just silence for months. And when I did finally get somebody's attention to just ask them some pretty basic questions, which were, hey, where's this project at? How comfortable do you feel with this project? The response from them was, quote, we can't get into details about a military aircraft program, which really struck me as odd, considering that this is supposed to be a project, a civilian project to repurpose military gear for commercial public uses. And the other thing they mentioned to me was that they said, quote, the FAA is working closely with the manufacturer to ensure the aircraft operates safely in civilian airspace. So it struck me immediately that safety was the issue here, and that's what the regulators were considering. And so I did a little bit of digging and found very quickly that there had been a major drone crash in San Diego in 2014, actually. A drone experienced a mechanical failure and was deliberately drowned in the ocean, and a subsequent mishap report that was put together by Customs and Border Protection, which had been responsible at the time for this flight, found that 18 similar drones had failed over the course of the preceding 9 months. So it's a pretty significant number of these. And if safety really is the issue, I just literally wanted the FAA to walk me through specifically what they might be concerned about and what we could expect. But in response, it was just radio silence. But we have in recent days and recent weeks discovered that drones are being used for other purposes. Can you walk? Do you know of any other examples? I mean, I know you do. Can you give us an example of that we've seen in recent days?
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about what happened. What was it, late last week or early this week, about how drones from the Border Patrol, they flew over in Minnesota and were very blatantly making their flight path known. I think the thing to point out about that too is the fact that these types of drones, they don't have to be detected on the systems that pick up flight paths and things that are flying in the air. They're not detectable. So the fact that they publicly announced that they were going 300 miles away from the border, which is out of their jurisdiction, mind you, and that they're there, they're surveilling the areas where people were protesting over the last, week and a half. It's definitely room for concern. And there was also there's a handful of examples of these to where surveillance drones that are outside of their jurisdiction are flying over civilian airspace, and like Border Patrol made it very, or Customs, sorry. Customs made it very clear that they were flying that drone over Minnesota for a reason.
Yeah, a CBP official had stated pretty clearly on Twitter that it was an aviation asset intended to assist local and state law enforcement. And if I understand correctly, the justification that they used was the fact that Minneapolis has an international airport, therefore CBP would have some jurisdiction over it. So even though it's more than 100 miles from the physical border, CBP does grant itself that, it has that authority to, at the very least, be there and to do that. But it is at the very same time, though, it is a densely populated metro. It's the same. It's similar to what we're seeing here, right? So in San Diego, General Atomics needs special permission from the FAA to test fly that drone above our city, but CBP, which already possesses a similar drone, is now able to just fly over Minneapolis and use it for what we assume are probably monitoring purposes of protesters. So the whole thing just. I don't really understand it, and I think my questions have been very basic and fair. And so the response from the FAA was to just ignore me, give me half answers that just didn't totally make sense. And so I filed a public records request through FOIA, which is the nation's open records law, in March with both the FAA as well as the FCC. And I dragged the FCC into it as well because they had okayed certain test flights for General Atomics out in the desert, which were related to what was happening here. That's kind of a side issue. But I went to both agencies and I said, hey, give me all the applications, give me the communications about this drone so I can understand what the issues are. And 2.5 months later, I hadn't gotten any reply from them. Technically, they had 20 business days to respond to me under federal law. And then there are certain mechanisms in which they can extend that period of time if they want to. But the point being, they were dragging their feet on it, and federal agencies and they have a history of doing this. So we filed a lawsuit to enforce the Freedom of Information Act and essentially say, you owe us records, give us records. And that's become an increasingly common way for reporters to get information, unfortunately, because sometimes it can take upwards of, if not months, then several years before you get the documents you want. And by the time you do, it might not be relevant or newsworthy. And so General Atomics was aiming to do this flight in 2020, correct?
Yes, it was supposed to be the summer of 2020. I don't know how far, if it's going to be pushed back because of what's going on right now with COVID. And they haven't, I haven't heard anything about it. I've been looking into things a little bit, but I haven't heard a concrete date.
Okay. And so, so agencies, when reporters tend to complain, and you see this all over the place, even on the local level, but when they tend to complain about how an agency is dragging their feet on a public records request, typically the response is, well, there's a lack of resources and we have a backlog of requests. It's going to take some time, which, yeah, on the one hand, I get it. That might be completely fair, but it's also the law. And so I feel like you just need to find a way to actually legally comply with what the public expects you to comply with. I don't think that's a crazy statement to make by any means. But you've been seeing more and more of these FOIA lawsuits over the last couple of years. And there's an interesting group out of Syracuse University called the FOIA Project, which has been tracking these things over the last couple of years, 15, 20 years. And they found that FOIA lawsuits had jumped 35% during the second half of the Obama years. I can't even imagine where it is at the moment now. It's just been progressively rising. And so on the one hand, a lawsuit feels like an extreme way to get information out of the government, but on the other hand, it also pushes your request up to the top. So it's not necessarily how we would like to engage with public agencies, but unfortunately, sometimes it's the only way that's necessary. And I think on a deeper level, the point I would make, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this as well, maybe as it relates to the Public Records Act in California, but at least with FOIA, it's a deeply flawed law because it gives the agencies which are creating the records, basically near total control over what it can release and what it can't release. And so the same agency that you're trying to hold accountable is now deciding what is and isn't in the public interest, right?
Yes.
That strikes me as a problem.
Well, yeah, it absolutely is. Like, who's to say how much information they're actually keeping from the public, right? And the fact that there's a literal catch-all exemption that they can just throw around whenever they'd like on it, and there's no way to hold them accountable for that unless you absolutely have concrete evidence that there is a document that they did not give to you because you got it from a different source. But that's, sometimes that's putting people's lives at risk when when they have someone on the inside who's giving confidential information like that. And that's a very extreme example, obviously, but it's still, for lack of a better word, it's complete bullshit. And no, but like, government agencies absolutely need to be held accountable, and that's at a local, state, federal level. But there's always that concern whenever you do start getting documents of, okay, but is this actually everything that y'all have? Or is it what you're willing to give me and what hasn't been, say, shredded or hidden in a different folder or accidentally lost?
So judges, when these cases have been dragged into court in recent years, judges have tended to be pretty sympathetic to the argument that agencies don't have enough resources to respond to these on time. So even though everyone acknowledges they're technically breaking the law, you have courts acknowledging that it's, there's a good reason for it because they just couldn't produce it as quickly as everybody would like. I find that really unfortunate. And I tried to make the point in my piece that we published earlier this week that one of the most admirable qualities of FOIA, which also extends to the Public Records Act, is the ability of anyone to know what their government is doing, and that has been used against itself. So to say that there are too many requests to actually comply with it is saying this thing, people like this thing too much. It strikes me as really ironic. Katie, what else? I'm looking for some questions here. Nate asked me about my beard. I'm just gonna have to side chat with him. Is there anything else though that we've left out about the General Atomics project and what's going on here locally?
I think one of the most, and we addressed this briefly, but I think one of the most concerning parts is the lack of ownership on this project, like finding out who knows what, who's in charge of what. That was one of the most concerning parts to me, is there was no one to hold accountable, and we're kind of like in the business of holding, government agencies accountable. And so that was always like a really concerning part of it for me personally.
Yeah, so the element of this that we haven't talked about is NASA is technically a part of this project too.
Mm-hmm. That's why you didn't sue NASA too.
So what struck me as really interesting though was I went to NASA very early on after your story published, and I said, I assume, hey, it's this agency that does all this cool stuff. It might be open and it might be willing to kind of engage with me on what this technology is and what they want to use it for. And the response I got from NASA was, go talk to General Atomics about that. We don't really know much. Like we're attached to it. And I found that disheartening. And so in addition to the fact that you couldn't get any answers out of local agencies, or at least they said, hey, we may or may not be supportive of this thing, but we're not overseeing it. Then you additionally had NASA, but NASA's been used as part of the marketing around this program itself. And so you see NASA in the press releases, and it's right there up on top. It's within the first couple of sentences. And yet when I tried to talk to them, they said, oh, just go talk to the company. So all roads lead back to the agency that's in charge of this. There's nothing necessarily nefarious about that, but it's just the idea that a private entity which is leading the charge on this is also the only source of information we have on what they're doing and why. So I guess if there's any point that we can stress over and over again today, that's it.
I kind of want to bring up one topic real quick. When you look at how these how drones are being used right now to surveil protesters and stuff with everything that's going on across the country right now, imagine if, you know, these drones do eventually go into the hands of law enforcement. And, you know, like you and I worked on everything last summer that showed just within the county what type of criminal cops we have. And it just, the fact that these drones with these insane capabilities can be potentially in the hands of law enforcement down the line at some point, I think that's really concerning.
Definitely. And somebody says here, sue NASA. I will look into it. Thank you. Okay, but here's a question. Name one city that a drone.
Sorry, you were breaking up. What?
Oh, sorry. So somebody asked a question here. Name one city that used a drone. I'm assuming that is. I mean, maybe this person can clarify, but I'm assuming that they're referring to the military grade drones or the commercial drones. I guess maybe Katie, that's a springboard for you. Which cities around here are already using commercial drones that we know of?
So commercial drones, we have Chula Vista Police Department who uses them excessively. We have, I believe it's up in Carlsbad too. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I don't have the list of police departments on me, but Chula Vista is one of the top drone pilot programs in the country right now.
And the county sheriff's department does as well, right?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, so okay, so this person clarified, name a city that used a drone for surveillance of protesters. Okay, so what we talked about earlier was in Minneapolis. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so that drone was from it's owned or used by CBP, and they were flying it over Minneapolis. Yes, they were flying it over a city within Minnesota. I cannot pronounce that name to save my life, but it was over a city in Minnesota, and they were actively using it to surveil protesters, and they were watching the protesters, and it was actually all over the news. But they were and like they made it very clear that they were using it. They were called in to use it, but it was and Jesse kind of clarified, I assumed that it was about 200-300 miles out of their normal jurisdiction. But Jesse said, you know, since they had an international airport there, it's technically within CBP's jurisdiction.
Yeah. Well, it looks like that's all we got. If anyone has any more questions, please drop them now. But all right, so this person asked to follow up: watching protesters or looters. To be clear, we know that the drone in Minneapolis was used by CBP to assist local and state law enforcement, and so the details of what they were using that drone for are not entirely clear to us yet. It's a CBP official had said they were going to assist law enforcement, so therefore we know that law enforcement is monitoring protests and down on the ground. So at the moment, there's a lot we don't know. We just know that they've been used in some capacity because we've been able to track them and because we have confirmation from CBP, but we don't know for sure. But that's something definitely to watch for, and I know other reporters are already watching for that, so I appreciate it. Thanks for the question. That's all from me on this topic. Katie, anything else from you?
I think I'm good.
You're good? Okay. All right, well, we'll continue to watch this, and we'll continue to keep everybody updated as there are developments on this. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, thanks for joining and asking questions and all that. So be well, and bye, Katie.
Bye.